Well, we have 1 hour. We have lots to do. You are standing. We have 2 speakers standing in solidarity with you. So we will go fast in this whole series. As you know, this is a session convened by UNESCO. My name is Guy Berger. I'm Director for Free Expression at UNESCO. I'm very pleased to be here in Tallinn, which, as you know, is a UNESCO World Heritage City, especially the Old Town. And if you have not been there, I suggest that you really do take your chance to go. So UNESCO, in case you don't know, it's part of the UN. It has 195 member states. They meet, it's like the General Assembly in New York, and they make decisions. Now they are facing this whole question of making decisions on the internet. So they required that we, as the Secretariat, have to make a study, and my 195 bosses will make a decision on the study. As 195 countries, UNESCO sees itself as a part of a universal organization representing all countries. We have a panel that we hope is also getting close to universal, because we had to balance our panel with gender, with region, with experience. So we have some people from the academia, some civil society, some from industry. So I think we've got some great panelists, and they will each bring a different experience to it. And I will introduce you to them shortly. But before that, let me tell you what this history is about, the study of UNESCO, and then I can explain. So let me get this, and then we'll open them. I will be asking them some questions, then I'll ask the audience for comments, and then we'll go around like that. Okay. Can we get the PowerPoint? It did work, yeah? Okay, back. Okay. There you go. Internet study. Right. Well, I wanted to start off just by introducing it, because I'm sure some of you know this cartoon. It says, "On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." Do you know what year this cartoon was done? 1993, actually. Close. Very good. So it's a very interesting thing, because this was an era of innocence, okay, when people could say this kind of thing. Today, I think you could ask many different things. You could say, nobody knows you're a bot if you're a robot on the internet. Many people will know you're a dog if you are a dog today, and they'll know what kind of dog you are, what kind of dog food you like. They'll know if you like to chase cats or postmen, or in the future they can predict if you will chase Amazon drones delivering things to your house. They will know where you take a walk. They know your favorite pole, where you relieve yourself. They will also know if you need to be muzzled, or maybe even neutered. These are the things that have changed. Now, UNESCO is trying to take stock of these changes. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is not just the question of the identity of the user and the privacy question, but as we know, many dogs are still not even connected to the internet. And third, we could say that many dogs are increasingly muzzled on the internet. They're unable to be heard, and others are unable to hear them. And fourth, it's a very interesting question as to how dogs or users are behaving online. Are they well trained? Are they civil? Are they aggressive? What's the situation there? So this little change of history and the way that the dogs, i.e. the users, is what UNESCO is supposed to do for a study. We are supposed to cover these 4 issues of access to the internet, freedom of expression, privacy, ethics. Okay. Now, what becomes quite interesting here is if I tell you how this came about, that our 195 governments told us to make the study. It began last year that Brazil came to UNESCO and said, we want a resolution. UNESCO should develop an instrument to regulate the question of privacy on the internet. As you know, Brazil was very inspired by the Snowden revelations. They came to UNESCO And they said, privacy is a human right. UNESCO should be dealing with human rights. UNESCO needs an instrument. Now, an instrument can be something like a convention. There are many conventions at UNESCO, cultural heritage, for example. So these conventions, they don't have a military to police them, but they are quite serious. They are monitored. Governments are held to account for a convention. And Brazil said, we don't want a hard instrument. We want a soft instrument, which is like a declaration. And other member states said, well, we don't like this, because if you start soft, it can become hard, and then it will lead to the UN system controlling the different individual member states. So there became a lot of negotiation, and it began with the question of privacy. And some countries said, if you criticize us for invading privacy, we will criticize you because you are not respecting freedom of expression. So therefore, now there's two issues. And then the developing world came, they said, you guys are talking those things. For us, access is the key thing, since access became a part of the thing. And then a group of countries who call themselves the Shanghai Alliance, that's Russia, China, they said ethics is really important on the internet. As you maybe know, they have been promoting a code of ethics. So they came and they said we must also study ethics. So as the political negotiations took place, we received this mandate as the Secretariat to do a very wide-ranging study. Now, this study, interestingly, it should also be consultative. So I thank you all for coming, and please, participate now, and you can give me your feedback later as well. So the last part of the study is options. So what should happen? Should there be some statement of values coming out of this? Should there be some programs? Should there be a convention? What are the recommendations in these areas that should arise from the study? So with the study, I'll just give you a very quick overview now. You cannot approach all these things blind as UNESCO, because, for example, some things, access, part of that is ITU. They are the UN agency dealing with access issues. So we have to scope it. What is relevant in access to us? Again, with some of the questions, some of the other questions, what is relevant to the kind of specialized agency that UNESCO is? So we came with this framework called Internet Universality. And we said this will be the starting paradigm that will structure the study that we have to do. This, I'll just tell you very quickly, it's a draft concept, but not yet accepted by the UNESCO member states. Maybe it will be. But anyway, this concept, it has got 4 elements, which we call ROAM. That's for rights, openness, accessibility, and multi-stakeholder. So we said this is really a summary of positions that have been agreed by consensus previously at UNESCO. But we took those previous documents starting in 1993, and we made this new concept. By the way, we took the rights, human rights based, and we said the definition of free internet for UNESCO, freedom means the respect for human rights. That's an interesting question. For openness, it should be open technology, open opportunities. For accessibility, it's not just universal access, it's more. It's how do you make the internet accessible and friendly for languages that are different to English, for women, for children, for minorities. How do you make the internet really accessible? So the accessibility is a more social concept, not just a technical concept, and multi-stakeholders. So this is the framework that we started to use. I will keep on going, then I'm going to ask our panel to give me some comments. Is this framework a good framework? Is it too complicated? What does it mean to start a study with this framework? So we start with the framework, and then we have to look at these questions. So on the left, you see this is the scope. We have no choice. The member states, they said, you have to research these issues on the left. On the right, this is how we want to frame the study. The rights, openness, accessibility, multi-stakeholderism. So it becomes very complicated because you must apply the rights framework to each of these 4 fields of study. Okay? You must apply the multi-stakeholderism to each of these 4 fields of study, etc. So you can begin to see how many lines there are when you try to apply a 4-leg framework to a 4-leg field of study. This is the same thing, it just shows you in a different basis. When we look at access, we have to look at access from the point of view of rights, point of view of openness, point of view of accessibility, point of view of multi-stakeholders, etc. So even the options, we have to look at them. What are the options in terms of rights, options in terms of openness, in terms of these things? Okay. I won't give you the detail here, but I'll just show you very quickly. So, for example, access question. We say access is a right. It's a right to information. Openness, we look for openness. So we unpacked each of these fields in terms of these things. So I won't dwell on this because I'm going to ask our colleagues on the panel if they have ideas on this. The same thing we did with freedom of expression. How do you understand freedom of expression, rights, openness, accessibility, and multi-stakeholder participation? And we did the same thing, okay, with privacy and ethics. So all this is on the internet, and all this I won't spend your time on now. But I want to come to the point. Out of this, we came with basically, we said we need to unpack the options as well. We said options for UNESCO. What should UNESCO be doing? Its programs in these different areas. You know, we are running, we have field offices around the world. What should we be doing? How should UNESCO be developing partnerships with other agencies, OECD, Council of Europe, the Organization of American States, etc., ASEAN, and so on. And number three, what should UNESCO, as part of the UN, be doing in the UN system to promote certain values and positions on the internet? And in the consultation, we have to consult all these different groups. This was also laid down by our member states in their wisdom. We have to consult these 6 different constituencies: governments, international organizations, tech communities, private sector, academia. So now we get into a bit more interesting area, and I'll just go through some of this. What are the questions we will try to answer in this study? So we said, in the questions of access to information, the rights question, how do we reinforce that right? In the openness question, how do you strengthen open knowledge resources? In the accessibility question, how can you increase local content and language? And how can media and information literacy, which includes digital literacy, how can this empower multi-stakeholders so that there's more pressure for the access and they can understand the importance of access? And again, I'm going to ask my colleagues here what questions we're missing. In the questions of freedom of expression, so how can you use law to protect freedom of expression? Is this national law? Is this international law? These are interesting questions. How can you enhance openness and exchange in freedom of expression? How can you use MIL, media information literacy, so that people who access the internet respect freedom of expression and champion freedom of expression? For example, when they deal with hate speech, which is regarded as a violation of freedom of expression, how should users respond to that? And how do you get multi-stakeholder participation in the self-regulation of hate speech or other kinds of expression? And the third area, privacy, is, again, starting with the rights. How can you ensure respect for the privacy, the right to privacy? How can openness and transparency be promoted and balanced around privacy? Okay, so everyone is keen on open data, but how does open data relate to privacy protection also? How can privacy as enhance trust, and is there a relationship between the trust that your privacy is respected and your access, your interest in accessing the internet? And again, multi-stakeholderism, balancing privacy with those other rights which was mentioned this morning by the opening panel. And the last area, ethical dimensions. How do you promote human rights, including the right, for example, gender rights would become very important on the internet. How do you promote openness? This is a very important question around copyright and open resources. There are ethical questions there. In what way can ethics enhance social inclusion, accessibility, and how can ethics inform multi-stakeholder involvement? You know, ethics in the UNESCO perspective, ethics is not the same as law or regulation. Ethics is something that can inform that, but it's also the choice of, it's freedom of choice within those frameworks. So that's it. Very briefly, the timetable. We're starting the study. We're testing now this framework, the questions, the concepts, and at the end of June, the end of May, we will finalize the questions. So it's your chance now to really help us get good questions. We have many consultations. We will start drafting this whole study in November. We'll have a big multi-stakeholder conference next year in February in Paris to say, here's the results of the study. This is what we found about rights with access, about openness with privacy, et cetera, and these are our recommendations. And then we have to report to the UNESCO governing bodies next year, 2015, and then we finalize and submit to the total governing body. So that's where it's going, and I don't know what the response will be of the member states, but the quality of the study will inform their response. So we're looking for your comments on the draft documents by the 15th of May. That's the framework of internet universality, the concept, the way we've unpacked the concept of the concept paper, the way we've unpacked the 4 areas using that frame, and the questions. And then once we have that, then we're looking for your final responses. So that's it, as by way of introduction. I hope you're all experts in the study. We have been having consultations with our member states, and because they gave us such a complicated thing, I don't think they realized how complicated it was until we presented it back to them. Anyway, now we have our wonderful panel, and I will introduce them to you, and then I will ask who wants to answer the first question about this framework of internet universality. So first of all, we have on our right over here, Bouzain Zaid. He's an assistant professor at the Al-Achawain, is that it? Al-Achawain University in Ifrane in Morocco. He's an author on public service television and mapping digital media in Morocco. So welcome. Then we have Joy Lidicott. She works for the Association for Progressive Communications as a human rights specialist. She was a human rights commissioner in New Zealand for 10 years, or nearly 10 years before that, and she's an expert not only in human rights, but also domain names. And she's been representing civil society in ICANN. Okay, who's next? Then we have Andrew Wycroft. He's director for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And this is an organization of how many countries? 34 countries worldwide that very much focuses on economic development policies. He's director for science, technology, and industry. Previously, he was head of information, computer, and communications policy. So I'm sure he'll be giving us what is the economic relevance of all this. Okay, who's next? Joanna Varon. She's from the Center for Technology and Society in Brazil. She's a researcher there. She's particularly concerned about human rights. She's also a film activist and a musician. And then we have Editon Ojo. He's the director of Media Rights Agenda based in Lagos. He's the chair of the Media Foundation West Africa. He's also the chair of IMS, International Media Support, based in Denmark, and chair of the Africa Freedom of Information Center. And the last on my left, but not least, is Susan Morgan. She's the executive director of the Global Network Initiative, which is many of the big technology companies and internet companies who came together to look at their social responsibility and how they can protect freedom of expression and rights online. Previously, she was in British Telecoms in the corporate responsibility team. So as you can see, we have a wonderful lot of people. And I'm not going to speak anymore. I'm just going to ask them some questions. And then I have to take notes while they're talking. So who would like to weigh in on the question of this internet universality framework? Is it of any value? Is it something that's too complicated? Is it something that is at odds with the other declarations and perspectives that exist? Who would like to respond?
The benefit of holding the mic initially. So I think, first of all, Guy, thanks so much for your kind of explanation for how the scoping and the framing came about, because I've written down as one of my sort of notes that I'd really like to have understood a little bit more about the purpose, because it wasn't very clear, from sort of reading the concept note. I don't know whether I'm asking for the impossible now. I've heard how this came about, but my sense was that overall it seems just incredibly ambitious in scope. With sort of just a huge array of topics. I mean, I looked at just one of the questions on freedom of expression. What are the optimum systems for self-regulation in cyberspace? That's sort of nestled in with about 10 other questions on free expression. It seems that would be like a huge study in its own right. So I think there's some real challenges around how to sort of come out with something that's, meaningful and concise and useful when the scope is so broad. So I don't have any magic answers for what you do, but I think it's worth asking the question at this sort of early stage.
Well, thank you. And just to respond to that, I know I said I wasn't going to speak more, but because we came with this Internet Universality Framework, which is what I really want to concentrate on immediately, we said Internet Universality, R-O-A-M, multi-stakeholder, M. So we said, M and freedom of expression, M is self-regulation rather than government regulation. That's why we put that question in. But maybe we shouldn't have such a complicated framework to start with. Then we wouldn't be asking that question about multi-stakeholderism and freedom of expression. A thought.
Thanks. Thanks, Guy, and also for the opportunity to comment on the framework. Just to step back a little bit from the last point, I think that the universality principle, I would encourage not to be too granular in excising it. I think that one of the strengths of the United Nations system is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proposes 3 core principles about human rights, which UNESCO and other UN agencies are familiar with, which is that human rights are universal, indivisible, and inalienable. And I think that simplicity is something that governments can agree on, and that civil society and other stakeholders are familiar with in terms of government's obligations to report on rights, and across multiple other agencies, including UNDP. So. And I think that that universality should link also to UNESCO's mandate, which includes rights to education, rights to culture, rights to the benefits of scientific progress. I think these are areas of expertise and familiarity within the UNESCO mandate. And particularly in relation to economic, cultural and social rights, there's really an absence of good dialogue and discussion about what the internet is doing there. So I would certainly encourage a focus on the universality principle linked to this idea of indivisibility. And I think particularly, for example, for governments trying to build their capacity in reporting on internet-related rights, not only freedom of expression, this is an area where UNESCO has a useful role to play. And I think seeing access in a similar way, if we look at access and the right to education and the right to health, we see the Ottawa Charter on definition of a framework for what access means, which governments are familiar with reporting on. We don't see a commonality of indicators for how governments report on internet access. And I think UNESCO and other UN agencies are well placed to try and support the development of that in ways which lend themselves to consistency across not only within the UN but also for stakeholders outside.
Thank you. Anybody else on the universality concept?
Well, just a quick word. I agree with Joy. I think it's ambitious, but I think it's worth doing. I see this as part of a standard-setting journey that UNESCO is embarking upon, and there are a lot of conversations going on around this issue. I don't think that it's leaving it vague without sort of clarifying the issue, I think would continue to create a lot of disharmony in the field. So I think building on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and various other instruments, including the final statement out of the Net Mundial last week, I think it's something that can be done.
Thanks. I'm probably the person in the room who feels your pain the most because I work for a Secretariat of Intergovernmental Organization as well. And yeah, you have a huge task in front of you, but I actually think it comes at a very good time. We need a big picture overview. That's what this will do. I think it is, and you have areas of expertise, as Joy has mentioned, on issues of freedom of expression and ethics that I don't think have gotten the analytical attention that they deserve. So one thing I would suggest is, on some of these slices, you can build and stand on the shoulders of other people who have dwelled in these areas, particularly in the areas of privacy. There's lots of other work that's gone on in that area, and also access. And so you may focus more on what are the interconnections between these areas? What are the dynamics between these different silos? And I think you could add a lot of value by looking at that. I won't go on, but just to say you already kind of outed me that I will bring in the economic dimension here, which I think is missing a bit in your document. The issues of privacy, you talk about the balance between public and private. Well, that's the elephant in the room a little bit with big data. And I think there's a huge economic dimension there in terms of productivity and social welfare and improvements, but at the same time, the ongoing worry about our privacy. Same things with access, and then I'll end. Access, to me, is fundamentally about getting the market right and having the market provide cheap internet connectivity. And governments, I think, have a limited capability in that role other than getting the framework conditions right and not doing dumb things like trying to use telecom as a general source of revenue for the country more generally, which jacks up the prices.
Okay, thank you so much. Anybody here want to make a comment on this Internet Universality Framework?
Thank you very much. My name is Maurits Stakaula. I work for the Dutch Permanent Mission in Geneva. I was interested in Geneva and the Human Rights Council. This discussion also touches on extraterritoriality, and if you discuss universality, it might be interesting to hear if you're planning to address that also in this very large scope that you're addressing in your study. If you think of human rights as a state that needs to respect rights of its citizens or people on its territory, then of course the question of the extraterritoriality comes into play. Also influences within the country, but also actions from the state abroad. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Michael Nelson with Microsoft. I had the privilege more than 20 years ago of going to 2 UNESCO meetings that were held in Monaco, entitled Info Ethics, Ethical, Regulatory, and Legal Implications of the Information Highway. 3 days, maybe 300 people. And many of the ethical issues that were discussed there are the same ones we have today. Unfortunately, they didn't really get their hands on the problem. So as you do this, I'd urge you to get your hands on the problem and perhaps do some real research, surveying people's views on the issues you're tackling. I think UNESCO has the ability to get data from a lot of different countries, perhaps do cross-country comparisons. A couple days ago, the Pew Research Foundation put out an amazing survey of 40 countries on what's ethical and what's not ethical. About 25 different topics, from premarital sex to adultery to drinking alcohol. If you did the same thing on internet issues, when is it okay for governments to censor, and ask people in different countries, you could get some hard numbers on why these issues are so hard to resolve. The output of these Monaco meetings was 0. I mean, a lot of good debate. At the end of 3 days, I put my hand up and said, we haven't even defined infoethics, have we? And the moderator said, well, you Americans don't understand. But then 2 ethicists stood up and said, no, he's right. Are we talking Kantian ethics or Hegelian ethics? So let's get specific here. Let's gather some data. Let's use your effort to collect some real information on these different issues.
I just have a broader question about how this project fits into a number of other UNESCO research projects. will this be the studies that you've been publishing on freedom of expression and, freedom of the press, and, there's a number of studies that you've commissioned that'll be coming out in the coming year. Are those kind of meant to be under this umbrella, or kind of how do they relate to one another? I'm just sort of curious how that kind of framework works. Also, maybe I missed it, but I'm curious about your timeline for this. And definitely, it sounds like something that would require a really big budget to do well. And so I'm just sort of curious how this is being funded and whether member states are committing to really support this. Oh, I'm sorry. My name's Rebecca McKinnon.
And thank you for all those comments, and I think we're going to move on in a minute, but I'll give, first of all, our panelists who are standing a chance to swap, and I'll answer briefly some of those questions while they're doing that, then we'll move on to my next group of questions. So in terms of whether the human rights will be done on the national basis or global basis, this is quite a complex question, of course, which I cannot see we can avoid at least reviewing the debate on that. Whether a Westphalian organization like a UN organization would take a different position to its Westphalian nature, I don't know. In terms of Rebecca's question, this study, not only is it consultative, but it will certainly build on a lot of other research being done, such as, I'm sure we'll look at that Pew study, we'll look at some of the stuff that Andrew referred to as well. So it's kind of trying to be cooperative and assimilative. Whether we can do new research, this depends on whether the member states, having given us this and no budget, decide that they will actually make this a study that's worth paying attention to. It could still be influential, it'll still be good, just on our existing secretariat, but if we really want to, I think, have a world-class, outstanding study, we need some member states to say, this thing is really worth it. It's not just a political compromise, it's a scientific, substantive exercise. Okay, so let me ask my next question. I told the audience, and you've all read, we've got a range of questions there that come from interrogating these 4 fields of study, and we used the Internet Universality framework to elicit these questions or develop these questions. The questions are about access, there are questions about freedom of expression, questions are about privacy, and questions about ethics. So, first of all, any questions about ethics that really should be tackled more? Any takers? We don't have ethicists on the panel. Okay, well, I'll come back to Michael and ask him at a later point for whether we have Hegelian or Kantian ethics, or non-Western ethics. Okay, so let's look at questions around privacy. Yeah. Please, sorry.
I think the ethical question would apply to some stakeholders, perhaps not all of them, but in particular governments and companies. For instance, if we think that the internet should be free, should be secure, there would be a lot of ethical questions about companies and governments that sell technology to repressive governments to be able to restrict access, to be able to survey or monitor their citizens and so on. I think there will be a bunch of questions around those issues depending on the stakeholder. But I don't think it would apply generally, especially in the case of users. I think it would be extremely difficult to set ethical standards for individual users and to sort of monitor compliance with those standards. But you could engage certain entities around the ethical questions.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's ask about the privacy questions.
So thank you, Guy, for the invitation. I also think it's a very broad study, and we should focus on the framework of the way forward, on the role of UNESCO to do so. If we take the document from Net Mundial, the roadmap is probably the weakest part because this way forward is more difficult to frame. In that sense, I think it would be very interesting. I would agree to have empirical data collected, so don't leave this study be only theoretical. And on privacy, I have some questions that I think we should add in relation to the right to anonymity, the right to encryption, questions regarding jurisdictional issues to access to user data, and the tendency on how not addressing those issues can lead to some sort of fragmentation of the web. Then questions regarding the duties and responsibilities of companies and states regarding users' privacy. They need to differentiate the kind of data and the procedures we do with the data. So if there is collection, processing, or interception of communications, so the standards and the procedures will be different. And it would be good to be able, thinking about the framing, maybe accessibility is more difficult to relate to privacy, but if you make it clear the relation of privacy and freedom of expression, then I think you can use that framing on accessibility. And finally, I would add something on this part of the study, considering the demilitarization of the web, and questions on this. I didn't did the questions and think about where they would fit in the framework, but I'll be happy to try to do this exercise for you if it helps later.
Yes, indeed, thank you. Buzain.
Thank you for your invitation. I mean, at a time when we have cloud computing and we have states developing capabilities to conduct a lot of surveillance, and I mean, it's very hard to compete with these two forces, either the private sector or states, and especially now with cloud computing, it's also an economic issue. It saves them a lot of money, of course, to do that. So to me, I mean, and I see the UNESCO playing a role here in educating users much more. I mean, put a little bit of focus more on that than it is on trying to, I mean, of course, policies are always important. Having mechanisms to ensure transparency, accountability are important, but also a lot of the work needs to be done at the level of users as well, because I mean, the more they know how to protect their own privacy, the better off we all are. Because again, technology is developing at a very fast pace that we don't even know how it will become in a few years. I read this article says that the last 2 years, the amount of data that has been stored is beyond anything that has been stored in for the rest of humanity. So this is just the past 2 years. So it's just getting more complex. So I think part of the focus has to be on users and educating them in terms of how they can use the internet safely.
Thank you.
So just a very quick thought. Just building on Joy and Andrew's comments about perhaps there needs to be something about the interconnection between these four points. I think maybe there's a couple of questions that don't sit neatly in the four buckets, but sort of sit on top. And I think definitely the role of companies and the role of governments and the role of other stakeholders, I think, is an important issue that doesn't seem to be addressed at the moment. And maybe something about the interconnection between the four areas of study, I think, would be important to address.
So if I could just touch on the issue of privacy, which I think is really essential here. And one of the things I want to, and here's an area where I think there's been a fair amount of work done, and not only the OECD, but other places, particularly Council of Europe. But I think you have to start with what is personal data? And that's an interesting question, particularly in the revelations of the last summer, because it turns out that metadata, which isn't really personal data per se, at least not in our privacy guidelines, can be used to basically impute persona and learn a lot more about you. And this is only going to increase as we move from Internet Protocol version 4 to version 6. Actually, you move from 3 or 4 metadata fields to almost 200. And so this is, and I think this brings in Susan's point and others, that a lot of this metadata is actually held as part of your transaction data by firms. And so their involvement here, I think, is instrumental. The last thing I just want to mention on privacy goes to Michael Nelson's point. There are different attitudes, not only between countries, but over time. He'll know the story that when George Eastman first brought out the camera, there was quite a concern about the invasion of privacy associated with this. Well, we wouldn't think about that now, at least many of us wouldn't. And so there's a shifting continuum, and I think you need to begin to look at how it may shift yet again.
Sorry, just to follow up on that. I really want to challenge this idea that there's consensus around what the position is vis-a-vis stakeholders' positions around metadata and privacy. And I think a very real concern that civil society has is that government perspectives on what is personal data for the purposes of human rights standards have been developed completely absent of any input from civil society groups and even mainstream human rights organisations in the various standard-setting bodies which states are reporting to. And when you think about the Human Rights Council, for example, and thank you very much for raising this point, there is a panel on privacy at the Human Rights Council coming up this September. And it is a discussion that governments will be having amongst themselves about how existing standards apply. So we're getting new norms emerging where some governments are already positioning themselves to read down or limit or restrict their interpretation of existing standards in situations where other stakeholders are either catching up, such as in civil society groups, or are already complicit in working with governments in these restricted definitions, such as corporates. And I think if we're to pick up the challenge that was put by the representative from the Netherlands this morning, let's have an honest conversation about that, about what balancing security and privacy means. And I think it's a useful thing for UNESCO to play a role in doing, in picking up in these standards, because for many civil society groups, more surveillance doesn't make them more secure, makes them feel more insecure. So I think I would encourage UNESCO to be thinking collaboratively and around these issues in ways which will assist debate going forward and not only be a snapshot of what the current issues are now.
Just a quick point on this issue. Given that a lot of users or citizens don't know when they're being monitored, I think we'll be relying on self-restraint on the part of governments and companies. So it would perhaps be useful to sort of find out what their understanding of the privacy issue is and under what circumstances privacy rights can be violated. Because it was quite amazing for me to see how livid a lot of leaders were when the Snowden revelations showed that their privacy may have been violated. And it appeared that for them it was very important, but for their citizens, they don't think it's such a great idea. So I think it would be useful to also find out how they understand this issue and under what circumstances it's okay, and what sort of safeguards, if any, should be in place before the right is interfered with.
Perhaps if I can just give a response, then I'm going to go to the audience. Certainly with this concept of internet universality, we focus on those 4 areas and see them as interdependent, that if you want the internet to be universal and you don't have rights being respected, you may have accessibility, but if you don't have rights, it's not universal. If you have rights but not accessibility, it's not universal, et cetera, et cetera. But with that, those 4 parts, the ROAM, it becomes very important in that perspective if you're balancing rights to link it to the other things. What does the balancing of rights mean from the point of view of openness, the point of view of accessibility, and multi-stakeholder participation in terms of establishing this balance? So I think there is some interconnection taking place there. The question of now taking that framework and you apply it to these 4 fields, which are different to the framework, how do the fields relate to each other? This is the question that I think people are underlining. In a way, I think I'm picking up from you that in some ways looking at the interconnections is even more important than looking at the specifics of those fields. So if that is the case, then we have an interconnected, interdependent framework, and we have an interdependent, interconnected object of study, and maybe the recommendations also become interconnected then. So over to the audience. We're looking particularly at questions, and then we're going to end up after this. We have 15 minutes left. After this round of looking at the questions and some of the big issues, I want to ask you specifically about the options. What should UNESCO be trying to do coming out of the study? But questions for now.
Well, I was actually going to speak to the privacy and metadata thing and actually point you to a resource. Perhaps you're already aware of it, but just in case, I want to flag. A group of civil rights and social justice groups in the United States recently published Civil Rights Principles in the Era of Big Data, specifically dealing with kind of human rights issues in big data surveillance and what the principles are around preventing abuse, particularly with metadata and analysis and so on. And so I would very much recommend taking a look at that. And some of the groups involved with developing those principles have also conducted some very useful research that breaks down how surveillance and, you know, particularly around metadata and big data affects minority groups, economically disadvantaged groups, religious minorities, and so on. Because once you get into the research and you really break down how surveillance and metadata surveillance is affecting particular communities that tend not to be majority advantaged communities, suddenly the harm becomes much more clear. And I think that in the global discussion on surveillance and harms, the impact on minorities of different types, on disadvantaged groups, is not sufficiently highlighted, and the extent to which you can draw out the research that's been done on this question, I think would be really useful.
Thank you very much. My name is Suleiman Abrahima. I work with the Media Foundation for West Africa. I share in the view that the study really looks very broad, and to that extent, I'm wondering how in-depth this study would go as far as the individual or the specific areas of focus are. And I'm also wondering if at the end of the day, the study would help us respond to some of the basic and thorny issues that we are confronted with in our work around internet freedom. So for example, you are asked, well, so you are promoting freedom online, so you are advocating for user anonymity, there should be privacy, and this is focused on the user. What about those of us who are not using and are being attacked, or our privacy being attacked or exposed by those who are using it? And then at the same time, you are saying there shouldn't be surveillance, there shouldn't be issues of dealing with or exposing users, and the privacy of users must be respected. At the end of the day, is this study going to help us, advocates on the ground, to be able to respond to some of these peculiar questions that we are confronted with daily?
Okay, well, perhaps just to respond to that question, we are hostages in a way, the Secretariat, of what your governments have told us what to do. They said, cover all these 4 issues, because they did not want only a focus on privacy, because that was seen as too political to only focus on privacy. Therefore, we have to focus on ethics and access and freedom of expression. And they said, do it comprehensively and do it consultatively, and no budget. Well, I think that some of them will come forward with budget. But anyway, this is really the kind of challenge, not just a political challenge, a scientific challenge, how to do a broad study and get some depth. At the end of the day, we also have to produce options, which are recommendations for UNESCO. Now, we can produce 100 recommendations, or we can produce 5. We also have to think, what kind of animal is this? It's not an organization that is likely to take a decision on a majority basis. They will look for consensual decisions. This is the whole purpose of the UN, that you should go there and try and agree, even if it's rather in the middle ground, because if you can't reach agreement in the UN, what's the point of the UN? So we can come with recommendations for A or B or C, but we also have to think, what is the number of recommendations, and what realistically can we get member states to find common ground on? Otherwise, it's a waste of time. So let me ask our panel if they have any views on this. What can the study do? What should it do? What should it tell UNESCO to do?
Well, I think one way to not be at the mercy of government is for UNESCO to also carry other stakeholders along. And if you come out with a report and a set of recommendations that other stakeholders, particularly civil society and NGOs, buy into, then they can lobby their governments very strongly to support those recommendations. But where it is dealt with at simply governmental level, then they are at liberty to throw away good ideas, so long as they feel that those ideas will not be to their advantage. So I think it's extremely important not to think only of what governments would be comfortable with, but really what is the best way forward, and ensure that other groups, users, NGOs, the companies, and in many cases you would also find that the companies themselves are hostages to government in terms of regulations and the environment in which they operate. So I think carrying them along would also help UNESCO to reach the objective that it wants.
Who else would like to comment?
Yeah, this is a hard one. I think what I would suggest is there's a number of high-level principles and declarations already out there. You know, WSIS has got its fair share. We, the OECD, produced a few. Net Mondial just produced what I thought was a pretty good, two very good outcome documents. I would avoid reinventing the wheel here and instead aim for those areas that aren't well covered by that other work. And in my assessment here, that would be more on the ethics and freedom of expression issues. Although certainly the latter, freedom of expression, is touched on in Net Mondial, and even our internet policy making principles in 2011, the OECD produced, it was the first line of the introduction. But
If I could just tell you briefly, when we had some consultations with our member states, some governments said, similar to that, other governments said these are all equally important, you have to deal with them all. So it's a bit difficult, but practically we have to figure out what are we going to focus on, what questions really are the most important questions scientifically and politically, Edison's point is well taken.
Thanks. Just to follow up on that, I think that one thing that might be useful, I mean, I've sort of been reflecting on the catch cry that, you know, the same human rights that we have offline must apply online. And it seems strange to me that 2 years ago that was really the first statement that the UN Human Rights Council made about rights. And it was kind of strange that they even had to make that statement, as if there was some question that our rights didn't apply. I think now's the time to move beyond that statement and to really ask, what does that actually mean then in practice? What does that mean in terms of access and state obligations to provide and enable access, not just to infrastructure, but in terms of content online? What does that really mean then in terms of the indivisibility of all rights and accountability for remedies? What does that mean then for governments who are obliged to report against international standards about their offline and online rights compliance? And I think that would be a very, very useful thing for UNESCO to be looking at these questions with the frame of, because I see huge gaps in that. And I think it's a really urgent conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, just I agree with Joy, and I think that if we really answer those questions, it will be a step forward. I don't think, for instance, that declaration from Net Mondial really addressed the issue of privacy and surveillance at all. So it would be very useful if we can have those questions and how we protect it online.
Yeah, I think, you know, some clarification around the different responsibilities of different actors, I think, would be very good.
I think, I mean, this principle of protecting the rights offline, online, I mean, for a non-democratic country or for non-democratic countries, I mean, it's really problematic because there are rights offline that people don't have. So, I mean, if we're doing that, we're actually hurting people. I mean, one of the options, I think, I mean, is just to develop arguments, very strong arguments, to keep the internet, I mean, better than what it is. Because, I mean, it's been really wonderful thing until, of course, the recent revelations, after the Arab Spring. I mean, I can talk about the Arab world. Well, governments were agnostic about the internet prior to the Arab Spring. Now they're paying very, very close attention to this thing. And, I mean, some of the arguments in terms of media policy, if we compare, I mean, the internet to other, media, let's say broadcasting is the most regulated medium. And because of course, spectrum issues, licensing, but also in terms of language, and because of the pervasive nature of broadcasting. When you turn on radio or television, you can't control what kind of content comes out of there. So we have to make sure that violence, sexual content, and so on and so forth is kind of restricted. This way, we're protecting the audiences. But for the internet in particular, it's the least pervasive. It's even better than print. Because at the individual user's level, you can actually do a lot of the blocking. If I buy a laptop to my child and I want him to watch pornography, I can do that from the computer. I can censor that kind of content, which makes the internet really the most liberating, empowering tool out there. But at the same time, for whatever ethical reasons or moral reasons the state wants to censor, well, you don't have to do that. The users can do it themselves. So in a way, we have to develop these very, very specific, clear arguments to keep the internet as this empowering, liberating tool for as long as we can. And I go back to the arguments made by Michael in terms of research. I think it's just essential to have more. I mean, going back to the idea of privacy, I mean, the way I define, or probably we define privacy, is not necessarily the way a 12-year-old right now defines privacy. Someone who I mean, and I think we need to know what these digital natives think. I think that's important, because we sit here, we're digital immigrants, we've lived through, I mean, as a young Moroccan, I lived with one TV channel most of my life, I mean, until the 90s with satellite television. So it's hard for me to really make decisions about something that I know my children, I mean, it's just we have to get digital natives in and get to understand how they think about these issues as we move along. Thank you.
Thank you. I think our time is almost up. I know that Edith had a point about the implementation of rights and the role of the UN. Shall we ask him that point? Or does anybody else have another burning point to make? Edith?
Well, my point really is there an agreement that these are rights? Because it seems that a lot of people, governments in particular, sometimes want to back away from them. But if we agree that they are rights, what are the elements of these rights? I think some clarification would be required, because a lot of them are not too clear. But most importantly, what are the remedies whenever these rights are violated? Because if you say something is a right and there is no remedy for violation, it's meaningless. You're just hoping that people will be good and respect the rights. But in the real world, there are those who really violate rights in full knowledge that they are violating rights, and they do so with the knowledge that nothing would happen. So I think it would be useful to have some remedies that go with a recognition that they are rights. And again, building on the principle that rights should apply online as they do offline. If you look at various instruments in the area of human rights, there are accountability mechanisms that can be adapted or even applied to violation of online rights. But I think we must have some mechanisms for enforcing compliance, or at the very least, for monitoring compliance.
Well, this is the decision that many people will take as to, in the distributed landscape of the internet, what kind of mechanisms will be there. As far as UNESCO goes, they will decide if they want an instrument or if they don't want an instrument. But the study becomes very important in terms of informing the member states what are the implications across the whole field of action in one. So I think we're out of time. And I wanted to thank this wonderful panel and a wonderful audience. And please, as I said, we are still finalizing these questions, the concepts, etc. So if you go on the internet, the website, UNESCO website, you can send comments. Once they're finalized, which, as I said, will be the beginning of June, please help us shape the study. It should really be a participative study, and that will make it stronger, and also persuade our member states that it's to be taken seriously, and persuade them to put some money into it, I hope. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your conference.